The world is always changing. We love trends. We're all uncomfortable with uncertainty.
Did you get nervous with no seatbelts or airbags?
And we've got all the money we need.
And so what I love about this book, Same as Ever by Morgan Housel, is that it does the exact opposite. So it brings us back to the basics. And it makes us realize that there are some things in this changing world that we're in that never change.
And so they're focusing on parts of human behavior that have never changed, that were true 500 years ago, that will be true 500 years from now.
We learn different lessons about opportunity, about risk, about patience, about living a good life that are very useful, but not in the way you would imagine.
I have no idea when the next recession is going to come, but I know exactly how people are going to respond to greed and fear.
So could looking at the history, the patterns of humanity, be more useful than trying to predict the future? Well, join me. In this video, I'll be diving into the short chapters of the book and sharing some thoughts along the way, so that hopefully gives you a good idea of the book, and maybe you'll end up picking it up yourself at the end. So the book starts off with an anecdote about Warren Buffett, the famous investor. So he was driving around with a friend in his hometown of Omaha, which was really struggling at the time.
And the CEO said to Warren, and they're driving past like closed up shops during the Great Recession, like the whole country's in tatters. And the CEO said, "Warren, how are we ever going to pull out of this?" And Warren said, "Do you know what the best-selling candy bar was in 1962? And Jim said, "No." And Warren said, "Snickers." And Warren said, "Do you know what the best-selling candy bar is today?" And Jim said, "No." And Warren said, "Snickers." And that was the end of the conversation. And that was his answer to, is the country ever going to be the same?
This is the paradox. That's the whole point of the book. Recognizing what doesn't change could paradoxically lead to a more foresighted approach of life, where you are better suited to expect the right things. And that's what we're going to get into with the next chapters of the book.
And I think if you look at Warren Buffett's success, he has been betting on things that stay the same forever. And it really hit me in that moment that this was the book that I wanted to write.
And I'll read you a quote here. "History is filled with surprises no one could have seen coming, but it's also filled with so much timeless wisdom." So this chapter is sort of a glorified butterfly effect recounting. It shows us that all of life is actually pretty random and pretty fragile. And so the way the chapter starts out is with a sad and just striking story where the author talks about a nearly fatal ski trip where small decisions had just a life-changing impact. And he uses that to set up the concept of the story, which is best put with a quote by Tim Urban, which goes, "If you went back in time before your birth, you'd be terrified to do anything, because you'd know that even the smallest nudges to the present can have major impacts on the future." And so through stories of near misses where the world could have drastically changed because of just one small minor thing, through these recountings, we realize that the world quite literally hangs by a thread. And this really emphasizes the value of realizing that the world is complex, that it is very interconnected. This chapter is all about how our biggest challenges often come from what was unexpected. And so the chapter starts out with a story about a failed NASA mission and how it really highlights that risk is what's left over after you think you've thought of everything. The argument here is that while we're really good at predicting what's predictable, the unforeseen circumstances, the rest of the stuff we didn't predict, is what actually matters the most. And there's a lot of examples of this, different stories, and actually a lot of them have to do with money and finance, which I think is really interesting. Remember, Morgan Housel is the author of Psychology of Money, which is really the book that really put him on the map. And I think it's really interesting to see just a bunch of personal finance examples in this chapter, because it really goes to show how human behavior, it really affects all parts of life. Because at the end of the day, who's interacting in the economy, who's part of the stock market? Well, it's humans. And so these timeless lessons, they really apply to everything, from finance to how you do at work to your personal life. All right, this is a great chapter. It explores the relationship between happiness and expectations. And what it really argues is that your contentment, your fulfillment as a person, depends more on your expectations than your actual circumstances. And this is really a mindset shift. And the way that it's illustrated is with a nice story about the 1950s. So the 1950s had really high perceived prosperity. And it isn't because in the 1950s they had higher standards of living than today. Like, absolutely not. We're doing better today in almost every field, from medicine to technology. But in the 1950s, the prosperity was perceived to be higher because there was less disparity. There were less differences between what you and your neighbor, or a person just across in the city in a poorer area, for example, was doing and was experiencing. And so this lower income disparity, this lower inequality, at least with regards to income, made people feel happier. And this shows how relative wealth and success really is. And it really shows how comparison can be at the root of dissatisfaction. Back to the investing world, this is best illustrated with this quote by Charlie Munger that's in the book, which is really about how crucial managing expectations is to your happiness. Okay, this chapter about the duality of genius is really interesting because I hadn't read anything like it anywhere before. Wild Minds posits that the traits that make individuals exceptional in one aspect can lead to sometimes undesirable, unconventional traits in other aspects. The idea is that greatness often comes with quirks that defy societal norms. Whether it's Newton or Elon Musk, we have these examples of people that have incredible achievements that we can all recognize objectively, kind of thing, but that have also had a track record of irrational or extreme behaviors that for most people can seem undesirable. People who think about the world in unique ways you like also think about the world in unique ways you wouldn't like. So the chapter really encourages a nuanced view of role models. Like, you can look up to someone for something in one aspect, but the idea is you probably shouldn't look up to them in more than that one aspect, or at least a few, because chances are, because of their greatness and their incredible achievement in that one aspect, the rest is probably not as great. If you like this concept, I recommend reading Outliers by Malcolm Gladwell, which is another book that I'd like to suggest because it's super related to this concept. So Outliers essentially has the author demystifying what makes someone great, what goes behind a person achieving incredible things. And after reading that book, you really have more of a grounded view of these people because it's less idyllic, it's less glorification of geniuses. And once you have that more grounded, humane view of these people, I think it's much easier to apply this concept that Morgan Housel is telling us in this book of viewing them as nuance, of understanding that their greatness can come with quirks that aren't as great in other areas. Wild Numbers is all about the human struggle with probabilities and why it's really hard for us to perceive risk accurately and think about inevitable events that are rare. The chapter starts with a funny anecdote where Jerry Seinfeld and Jimmy Fallon are in a car, and one of them is like, "Aren't you worried about not having an airbag?" And the other goes, "When have you actually needed an airbag?"
Did you get nervous with no seatbelts or airbags or any of that stuff? Or you don't?
How much have you really used the airbags?
The chapter has examples of winning the lottery and other events and situations where it's really hard as humans to perceive probability accurately, and how it's hard to make decisions based on numbers that we can't really grasp or understand. It also goes into topics like media influence, cognitive biases, and how, understanding that the world is just a bunch of probabilities can lead to better decision making. The takeaway is short and sweet here. The idea is that compelling narratives, stories, anecdotes, regardless of their accuracy, can outshine even the most factual data in persuading audiences. The effectiveness of communication often hinges a lot more on the cognitive and emotional impact of your story and what you're communicating than the actual content, than the underlying facts. And this is illustrated by examples from Martin Luther King and his speeches, and the book Sapiens and its success. The best story wins. This chapter is about how not all influential forces and factors can be quantified. There are limitations to how much data can predict and measure human behavior. And the idea is that emotions and perceptions often outweigh facts in decision making. And so we have stories of GameStop, the stock that surged, and Lehman Brothers when they collapsed. Quantitative models often fail to account for human unpredictability. We need to recognize the irrational as a key factor of navigating complex systems. Through Minsky's financial instability hypothesis, this chapter explores the cycles of greed and fear, and it really goes into how optimism during times of stability can lead to instability, like excessive debt. This fundamental human behavior is not just in financial markets and investing. There are examples on pandemics, like the idea that we hadn't had one in a very long time.
But there's one area where I hope we never go back: our complacency about pandemics.
We underestimated the likelihood of something happening because of the optimism that came with stable times. This is about the pitfalls of exploring growth beyond natural or sustainable limits. We hear about the story of the tallest man and how he had a bunch of health problems because of his height. And so the idea here is that whether it's a person or a company or any other project, there is an optimal size or pace, speed to doing things, where if you go beyond it, you're sacrificing a bunch of things like stability, sustainability, health, and just generally getting a lot of trade-offs for the scale you're trying to reach or the speed you're trying to go at that is beyond the natural optimal size or speed for whatever you're pursuing. So we get the example also of Starbucks that faced a bunch of challenges and structural pitfalls when it expanded too quickly and opened too many cafes at the same time. This is essentially a cautionary tale against our modern need for quick wins. It really shows that enduring value comes from steady, deliberate, and slow growth. This chapter discusses how significant changes and innovations often stem from adversity. And so it starts with a story of a 1911 fire at a factory that led to a reform in workers' rights and a lot of safety initiatives. We also get examples of military innovations like the internet and the radar that really came out of adversity. We also hear about how the Great Depression caused a lot of innovation because of the hardship and the economic difficulty that a lot of people were facing, pushing them to innovate and to create new opportunities. And this is the idea that necessity is the mother of all invention, right? And that a lot can come from adversity, this silver lining. The chapter cautions against trying to live a challenge-free life because of the importance of adversity, which can sharpen focus, increase collaboration, and just reduce barriers to progress and innovation. This chapter highlights how quickly bad news strikes and the slow compounding nature of good news. We get a quote from Warren Buffett that goes, "It takes 20 years to build a reputation and 5 minutes to destroy one."
And we've got all the money we need. We'd like to make more money, but we got all the money we need. We don't have an ounce of reputation beyond what we need, and we can't afford to lose it.
And so we get other examples like heart disease reduction and treatments over time. These are very small incremental changes, like deaths were maybe reduced by 1% or 2% every year, but that's not enough to get a headline and it doesn't show up in the news. But what does show up is disastrous events where a lot changes in a very short period of time, and often that tends to be the negative events. Bad and good things accumulate over time. For example, the Great Depression didn't just come from one factor that happened over a year or two before the event happened. It was a history of real estate speculation and stock market overvaluation that led to it. It's something that compounded over time. Same thing for positive developments. They often come from unnoticed improvements. For example, the elimination of a disease comes with losing 1 or 2% of its prevalence every year, but we don't notice that. We just notice when it's fully gone. And so this is really a nod to the importance of small improvements and incremental change. This idea that you could do something just 1% better every day and the result after a year is just incredible. Pessimism helps us prepare for risk, while optimism fuels the belief of a better future. This chapter uses the example of a prisoner who maintained faith that he was eventually going to be released, but was very aware and pessimistic about the harsh realities that he was facing in jail. And so he had this acceptance and this knowledge of what was going wrong, hence the pessimism, but also this optimism that drove him through and let him stay the course. It's similar for the American dream. A lot of people still believed in it during the Great Depression and other times of economic difficulty. Bill Gates is also mentioned as a good example. He credits Microsoft's success to balancing optimism and pessimism. He calls himself a rational optimist, where he knew about Microsoft's potential, but was very cautious in the finances of the company and how he approached potential risks because of pessimism that ended up serving him in the future. This chapter is about how striving for perfection can actually lead to vulnerabilities and less optimal outcomes. So we get examples from work where Albert Einstein used to take walks of doing nothing, and that helped him be more productive. It's very true, like this is a concept nowadays, the mental health walk or the hour of doing nothing that you schedule on your calendar, right? And it helps you be more productive because you can't just be perfect and hustle all the time. We also get the example of COVID-19, where the companies that had slack in their logistics, so extra inventory or extra room for delays or things like that, did much better than those who had a perfectly oiled machine where there was perfect operations and perfect efficiency, and who suffered tremendously when COVID hit. It's the same for investing, which is, again, he's the author of Psychology Money, so we get a lot of these examples. It's the same for investing, where having an approach that's approximately right, where you're doing most of the good things, often yields better results than someone trying to do everything right. Worthwhile achievements often require enduring pain and discomfort. And so we get examples in this chapter that illustrate this, like the Donner Party. There is this story of a group that tried to take a shortcut instead of the normal long route to travel somewhere, and they ended up facing dire consequences. There's a quote that we get also from Lawrence of Arabia that goes, "The trick is not minding that it hurts." This captures the mindset. This idea of embracing the struggle really helps in every field. We need to recognize the value of stress and doubt and perseverance. This chapter is about the transient nature of competitive advantages, which emphasizes the needs for continuous effort and innovation. So we start out with a biological example, or a very sciencey one, where we talk about Cope's rule, which is essentially that the longer a species has been around, the higher its risk for extinction. We get an example from business also with Sears, the department store that grew so big that no one thought it could fall or end, but that's exactly what happened, and it went bust. In nature and in business, the idea is that entities need to continually adapt to maintain their position. It's not just natural selection. The quote goes, "The only thing harder than gaining a competitive advantage is not losing it. You need to keep running." This chapter explores the common underestimation of new technologies and innovations, and the journey that goes from skepticism to adoption that is often forgotten about. It critiques this idea that everything has been invented and that the era of innovation is over by using mentalities and concepts from Thomas Edison, for example, the inventor who believed that the potential for discovery is limitless. The idea is that innovation and new discoveries build spontaneously and over time. Unexpected links can lead to results like these that were just life-changing, and it really challenges this idea that there's nothing else that can be invented because everything has already happened. This chapter is about the deceptive nature of appearances and how people often project idealized versions of their lives and hide the difficulties and essentially everything negative that it took to get to where they are. There are examples of celebrities and iconic figures, but also the author's own struggles with stuttering, for example, and how he came a long way to today. By acknowledging that hardship is universal, the chapter encourages a more compassionate and realistic perspective, warning against elevating individuals based on solely their success in specific areas. This chapter explores how incentives drive human behavior and can push people to act in their own interests even when it comes to ethical decision making. The chapter explores the dilemma of navigating complex, conflicting interests and uses examples from subprime mortgage bankers to drug lords to illustrate the interplay between financial, social, and moral incentives. It really pushes us readers to reflect on what went behind the decisions we're making and to really think if we would be making the same decisions if a world existed without money and we were in it. Personal experiences shape beliefs and actions in a way that no theory can match. You learn by experiencing and by living, you learn from your mistakes and not necessarily by the theory and lessons that people tell you. This chapter really illustrates how extreme circumstances can shift perceptions and priorities, showcasing transformative experiences that redefine understanding, empathy, and action. From policy changes after the Great Depression to responses during crises. And it's a really interesting take because it really hits on what the book is about. There is a gap between long-term planning and short-term obstacles, and this is what this chapter is all about. It's easy to be at the bottom of Mount Everest and just point at the top and be like, I am going there. But then that's when the challenge really starts. And so Housel really highlights the importance of resilience and adapting to short-term obstacles when trying to reach a long-term goal. He advocates for a more balanced approach to information consumption, distinguishing between enduring knowledge and quickly outdated information, really in line with the theme of the book. Okay, as someone that really likes intentional laziness and this whole work smart, not hard thing, I really embrace simplicity and I enjoy it in my life. This chapter is great. And so what it goes into is this human tendency, especially in academia and professional settings, to favor complexity over simplicity. Despite how efficient simplicity can be, whether in actions or in communication, it is often viewed as ignorant, and we prefer complexity because we mistakenly associate it with effort and intellect. It actually takes a lot more time and effort and intentionality to write a short email than a long one. You often even start with a long text and shorten it down. And that's just a dumb example I'm adding here to show you how simplicity has its value, and it's this human tendency is something that we really need to overcome and keep in mind when we approach situations. This is such a lovely chapter to end on because it's about this listening, this understanding of others that is just super important in everything we do in life. Major events leave psychological scars, and personal experience really shapes perspective on how you approach things, on how you make decisions, and on the stances you take on various topics and discussions and issues. The chapter advocates for empathy and open-mindedness and understanding that learned behavior plays a role in how people perceive the world. There is a discussion around Pavlov's experiments of how extreme circumstances can override previous conditioning. But the idea is that to bridge gaps between your perspective and that of someone else with a different life experience, it really comes down to empathy. And this can be very useful for navigating disagreements and other conflicts that arise in your life. All right, before I share the book's conclusion and how it ends, I really would appreciate it if you can give this video a like, if you could share it with someone that you think would learn from it, and if you could subscribe to the channel if you want to be notified of similar videos when they come out. It takes a lot of work to distill hundreds of pages into one video, and I would really appreciate it because it makes a lot of difference for the channel, and it takes just a second. And it's free. Not many things in life are free, so I'll give you a second to like and subscribe. All right, the book ends off reminding us that it is more useful to learn from the patterns of history than to look into research or try to make predictions of the future.
Because for my entire career as a writer, I had been just astounded at how bad people are at forecasting. Not just in finance and the stock market and the economy, but in politics. And it's been like that forever. Like, the most famous expert's ability to predict what's going to happen next is atrocious. And then it was like, okay, is there a positive spin to this? Like, how can I use knowing how bad we are at forecasting to try to do better at my ability to look forward in the future? And I think what I settled on is people are so bad at predicting the future because they're always trying to predict what's going to change. They're always trying to predict what's the next new technology, who's going to win the next election, when's the next recession going to come. And our ability to do that is zero. It's virtually zero. But for the people like Buffett who focus on what's not going to change, their ability to understand the future is actually pretty good. And so they're focusing on parts of human behavior that have never changed, that were true 500 years ago, that will be true 500 years from now. And so I have no idea when the next recession is going to come, but I know exactly how people are going to respond to greed and fear.
And this is the best summary you're going to get of the whole book. This is a fitting conclusion, and I hope that you keep in mind at least one or a few of the lessons I spoke to you about today, and maybe consider picking up the book, because hearing about it in a YouTube video is one thing, but when you read through this, when you spend time going through the stories, it really helps you internalize them more, and maybe it will serve you better for your decision making. So there's a link in the description below to the book if you want to check it out. I recommend reading it. I enjoyed reading it, just like The Psychology of Money, the previous book by the author. And if you have any thoughts, or if you have read the book, or if you resonated with one of the lessons I shared, please leave them in the comments down below, and I will respond. I always do. All right, thank you for watching. I appreciate you getting to here, and have a great day.